wonderful Space Insider conversation. And this time we are talking about the US and China's relationship. So the US inadvertently helped kickstart the Chinese space revolution. And now these two countries are competing in nearly every area of space development out there. And I think a lot of us here are wondering who's going to win this new space race? Well, we have an expert to give us the inside scoop on what's happening in China's space economy. Up next, we have Namrata Goswami, who is going to talk to us about China's space policy. She's the co-author of Scramble for the Sky. She is a top US expert on China's space program and a highly respected academic space analyst. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Namrata Goswami.
Thank you so much for having me. Can you all hear me? Great. So what my work is on is about China's space program, and also to look at how China's space program is actually holding out in terms of long-term goals. And so if you look at the title of my presentation, it says China's Space Program, Civilization Project of National Rejuvenation. So you must have seen in the last few weeks there has been a lot of news media articles on the 20th Party Congress. And one of the interesting insights that you get from the 20th Party Congress is that for the first time in the Politburo, which is the highest decision-making body of 25 members, there are two who are actually rocket scientists, and they have been head of China's space program. And also, if you look at the nearly 200 members of the Central Committee, which is the largest decision-making body, about 20 of them are, again, rocket scientists and futurists, which tells you that China is very serious about its space program, and also that it views its space program from a grand strategic civilizational perspective. So if you look at China's grand strategy in space, given what I have told you in terms of the changes in party leadership, the other interesting thing about party leadership is that when we talk about inclusion, not a single woman made it to the Politburo for the first time since 1997, which also tells you that the Communist Party of China is very much determined by who they want to promote and what is the image they want to give the world. So when you think about negotiating with China, you need to keep that in mind as well. So when you think about China's grand strategy in space, it's truly about showcasing an alternate political vision vis-a-vis the United States. And one way that China is actually accomplishing this particular goal is to offer the world an alternate understanding of the Belt and Road Initiative, which also includes the Spatial Information Corridor. So when I talk about the Spatial Information Corridor, it includes three very important pillars. One is that it is about helping other countries to develop their capability in terms of space. Second, it is very clearly articulated by President Xi Jinping that it's about the leadership of the Communist Party of China vis-a-vis the United States so-called, as the Chinese call it, democratic system, which in their perspective is not a legitimate system. And then finally, it's about the economic potential of space. So they don't really talk about inspiration. If you think about how Chinese taikonauts actually, when they go to space, for example, to low Earth orbit, and they come down, the first words they utter that this is all about Chinese national rejuvenation. So it's a very much a nationalistic space program. Now, one of the ways China has learned from history in terms of its space program is that particular image you see on the right, which is the famous ship of who? Zheng He. So Zheng He is basically a Chinese explorer from the 15th century, and his treasure ships were the talk of the world at that time. But what happened was that because the Ming Emperor was unhappy with some of the expenditure around the treasure ships, they actually burned their ships. So when I went to China and I asked this question to my Chinese colleagues about what is it that inspires China's space program, he told me that why don't you go visit the Maritime Museum, which is about 40 kilometers out of Shanghai. So I took a train, got there, and when I entered the Maritime Museum, the first image that comes to you is this particular ship. And the most important statement in that particular ship is that never forget this humiliation that happened to us because of our inability to innovate and our inability to recognize our own people's innovation capability. And so President Xi today points out that China wants to innovate in space and basically innovate so that they do not repeat the mistakes of the past. And China's grand strategic thinking in space is long-term, and I'll tell you a little bit about that soon. So one ways that my research brings some validity to the kind of argument that you have heard some of the other speakers speak today, for example, Dr. Kaluchi as well, that China's strategic culture is very much determined by three very important core concepts. You might not agree with their concepts, but that's their concept. One is that they connect resources to territoriality. So you see this with Antarctica, where China is building a research base and is actually talking about accessing the resources of Antarctica once you're able to do that with climate change, the Arctic. The South China Sea, where they argue that the South China Sea belonged to them historically, no matter what Philippines or Indonesia or Taiwan might think. Their argument is that their history is not valid, it's our history that is actually the more determining history. And so why is it that suddenly space also is entering this particular lexicon of territorial, as they call it, the high ground? And so their argument is that there are certain resources in space. For example, one of the key areas that China wants to invest in is the moon. And they argue that if you really want to become a spacefaring civilization, you have to connect territoriality to resources even in space. And so lunar South Pole is a very critical area for China, and accessing the resources there is also a very important area. Second is first presence benefit. So historically, China has always pointed out that areas that they claim are theirs because they were somewhere first. Tibet, which actually was under the Tibetan Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama, as you know, is in India. I come from an area in India originally that is Northeast India, which is very close to Tibet. And some of the areas that I lived is actually claimed by China, also because of not just Tibetan connection, but because there are resources there. And then they also point out that if you really want to become a country that is recognized in space, first presence matters. So getting to the lunar near side, getting to the lunar far side, which they did in 2019 for the first time, is absolutely critical for Chinese strategic thinking. And then finally, core and legitimate interest. So the fact that Russia intervened in Ukraine is not because that Putin had nuclear weapons or that he had this grand idea of a greater Russia. It's also because China recognized Russia's legitimate claims in Ukraine. And the first person that Putin actually went to meet is President Xi Jinping, just before the Olympics. And then so space is actually now identified as legitimate interest. Not core as yet. Core is Taiwan, South China Sea, and Tibet. But they are getting there because from legitimacy also it becomes a very core national interest. So based on that grand strategic thinking, the fact that China has a very long-term goal, what are some of China's long-term space goals? One is they're starting to invest in this concept called space-based solar power, which is about harnessing the energy of space in terms of solar energy and beaming it back to Earth. And in fact, they are the only country in the world that has a national program for space-based solar power. The United States does not have it. You have programs which are funded by the Air Force. You have one with Naval Research Laboratory. There are certain commercial actors doing this. But actually, China is the only country that has a space-based solar power project. Second is the concept of lunar and asteroid mining. So for them, and this is something that I find missing in the American discourse, is that for Americans, the idea of the moon as an intrinsic territory by itself of strategic value does not exist. If you listen to the Artemis program, it's about using the moon as a way to get to Mars. But for China, the moon is actually something that is core to their identity. It's very close to Chang'e, which is the Chinese moon goddess, and they actually have lunar festivals in respect of the moon. So the moon is intrinsically valuable to China. It's not about using the moon to get to Mars. So this is where societal connection comes in. So for example, we use the word Apollo and Artemis. I don't know how many Americans actually have an intrinsic connection to these Greek gods and goddesses. But actually for China, Chang'e is there in their everyday life. And so there is a deep connection. And then finally, if you look at their long-term idea, it's about establishing permanent presence. So if you listen to the Chinese discourse, and when I was in China, I asked this question of them, that will they have a lunar human program? For China, it's not about sending a Chinese taikonaut for a few days there. It's about establishing economic capability and being able to establish it for a very long time. So it's again a very different thinking of space. So if you look at this particular chart that I have up there, it's about their space-based solar power program. So this is what I built from looking at their official data on how are they going to prove this concept. So this was put up by the China National Space Administration. And if you see that by 2050, they hope to represent to the world a gigawatt level demonstration of power. So why is space-based power so important for China? It's because they realize that they'll run out of fossil fuel, and the only way that they can sustain a developed lifestyle is to access a renewable energy, which is 24 hours. The physics actually is there in terms of developing this capability, building solar satellites in space. The only thing is that it's expensive, and the launch costs are expensive. So the idea is to actually use the moon and the lunar resources to then build this particular capability. And if you are interested in looking at their peer-reviewed articles on how they're going to build it, you can find it in the website of Oxford University, where their lunar head actually published a piece very recently. Another demonstration of space-based solar power. And as I mentioned before, this is where China is way ahead vis-a-vis the US. So they are actually thinking of a whole logistics system around space-based solar power. And why do you think it's so critical for China? Because one of the founders of China's space program, Wang Shishi, is the soul and the heart behind their space-based solar power program. And his rationale is that the country that's going to actually crack this particular technology is going to be the leader in terms of future capabilities. So this is again a description of their lunar program. So for the US, we of course have the Artemis program to go back to the moon by 2028. For China is a much more longer term goal. So it started in around 2007 when they actually demonstrated their first capability to go to the moon. And then by 2036, China wants to establish a base on the moon. And guess with whom they're collaborating? With Russia. So they just signed a memorandum of understanding with Russia where they want to build this lunar capability by 2036. And they've actually given you out a press release where they give you the entire design of how they're going to achieve it. And since 2019, the Chinese confidence in their lunar program is much higher. So when I was in China a few years ago, the question that I asked them was that, when are you going to actually put cislunar space, which is the space between the Earth and the moon, into your official document? So if you want to understand how China's program proceeds from propaganda to actual policy and then to actual programs, one way to see it is that, has it made it to the official document? Once something makes it to the official document, it's something that they are confident about building. And so in 2022, when they published their white paper in January, they actually included the concept of cislunar space into their program, planetary defense, space industry, and renewable rockets by 2025. So SpaceX has competition now. It's not that it's only Starship. You have the Long March 9, which is about, which has the capability of launching about 140 metric tons to low Earth orbit, is their version of a reusable rocket, and they hope to achieve it by 2030. And then when you talk to Chinese thinkers on whether they think the United States is going to clinch the Artemis program by 2028, they're not confident, seeing how things are getting delayed, and they argue that one thing that we have succeeded is that we are able to meet our deadlines, because there is clear articulation of deadline since 2002. We've demonstrated it for the moon, for Mars, but the United States does not seem to meet its deadlines in this particular era, and the world is watching as to who is more capable in this regard. And so, again, another depiction of their lunar program, and they have very, very good capability in terms of studying the lunar surface, in terms of instruments that they're sending up. In 2024, they'll be sending humanity's first probe to the south pole of the moon to study the resources there. Today, the Chang'e 4 is still active on the far side of the moon, and it's the only capability that humanity has on the moon today to study what is there in the far side, which we cannot see. And then finally, their Mars program. So China also has a very, very capable Mars program, and in fact became the first Asian nation to go to Mars and communicate back successfully. And then what they have done is that in the last few years, they've actually put out basically, So in the last few years, they put out a complete roadmap for Mars as well. So by 2045, they want to build a human landing system for Mars, and by 2049, achieve a base on Mars. So you might think that these are very outrageous, for example, deadlines to put out. But once you have the head of the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology put it out, you know that they are having very serious thinking about this particular Mars program. And you see their thinking is so different. It's not about just showcasing it for technology, it's about long-term presence, it's about leadership of a system where they are competing with the United States. And then of course they have their asteroid deflection mission. From the Chinese perspective, which they are launching this year, they have named it Zhenghe, after their famous traveler of the 15th century. They argue that if China is capable of deflecting a particular asteroid, that would be a great service to humanity, given what happened to the dinosaurs millions of years ago, and which could happen to us, that we might actually all collapse if an asteroid hits us. And so and in this particular program, they're again collaborating with Russia. So Russia-China is having a deep collaboration in regard to space. So the one thing which is important to realize is that China's space program is not similar to the US space program. So we have a tendency to argue that China has a civilian space program who we can negotiate with. They're very similar to how we structure our institutions. But actually, China's space program is a collaboration between military, civilian, and commercial. And one of the documents that you should look at is the 2021 National Defense Law that they passed, in which they pointed out that everything that China's commercial sector does in space is within the civil-military fusion strategy. So everything is about national rejuvenation and the national defense. So when you think about inspiration, when you think about negotiating with a country like China, it's really important to understand that they have a different structure from the United States, and to really recognize that they might not have the same inspiration as you, and very different in terms of their conceptual thinking of what space is. So finally, some future timelines for China, especially their space-based resources. They've already succeeded on their Mars plan, which they actually told you 10 years ago they'll do. They are building their permanent space station as we speak, the Tiangong space station. They have an asteroid exploration program by 2034. And one of the technologies that China is prioritizing today is nuclear propulsion. So given all those ambitious goals that they have of going to Mars, establishing a base on Mars, the one technology they think will help them build that leadership structure is nuclear propulsion. And so today, the Chinese Academy of Sciences has a very serious program on building nuclear-propelled spacecrafts. So to summarize, space is now a very important part of the Communist Party of China, and it has very high-level continuity. That is how they differ from the United States in their ability to commit to long-term goals, and also to become one of the foremost nations in space by 2045. It's critical to their 2049 Centennial Goal celebration. And then the important point to remember is that they have a very integrated military strategy in terms of space investment and development. And finally, I want to put this point again and again, that culturally for China, the strategic real estate is the moon. The moon is intrinsic to how they become a spacefaring civilization. And once they establish a presence on the moon, then they are thinking about going to deep space based on certain long-term goals that they have identified. So I think I am going to end there, and thank you.